Matt's was a popular boutique breakfast spot near the center of town, just outside the University District. Rumor had it the name came from a crew of organized crime figures who once used the building to hide from police during the Prohibition era. More likely, it referred to the district itself, which had once been lined with industrial laundromats. Over the years, stories blurred together. Some claimed the city's political machine forced all laundromats into one zone. Others swore there was a shadowy connection between gangsters and washing machines. Whatever the truth, the facts had long since slipped into folklore. What was certain was that the Mats consistently ranked among the city's top 3 breakfast restaurants in the annual survey. Richard Sides and Paul Eckhart seemed to agree. They stopped in at least once a week. They were familiar faces but not fixtures, recognized as generous tippers and easygoing patrons, though never on a first-name basis with the constantly rotating staff. Their conversations over breakfast were usually short, more functional than social. Eckhart always ordered the ball of wax, 2 strips of bacon, 3 eggs, 2 slices of toast, hash browns, and bottomless coffee. Sides would scan the menu as if weighing new options, though he almost always settled on either the chicken biscuit or pancakes, his go-to rotation. Today was different. The two weren't simply grabbing breakfast and talking real estate or private matters. For the first time, they were expecting company. They knew little about Brian, beyond the fact that he was the only friend from Alfonso's past who'd stayed in regular contact. The two had met just after high school and shared a long, uneven struggle with sobriety through their college years. They drifted apart while Alfonso spent time out of state, then reconnected when he returned. Both had cycled through multiple relapses and multiple stays in the same rehab facilities, often at the same time. On more than one occasion, those stays turned into schemes. The two found ways to smuggle substances past the strict protocols, laughing later that they'd managed to get higher inside the facility than out. It was a vicious loop neither had fully escaped. When the door to the restaurant swung open and a haggard figure stepped in, both men knew immediately. Brian. He was tall, easily over 6.5 feet, but carried himself as though weighed down. He looked sober, but worn thin. His bright, dirty blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail, combed but visibly unwashed. His face was gaunt, framed by an out-of-style goatee in need of care. It was just after 7 in the morning, yet he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles pooled under his eyes, so stark that for a moment, neither Sides nor Eckhart could tell whether they were bruises from a fight or the hollow marks of sheer exhaustion. He must have recognized them immediately as the same men who had called him. Before arranging the meeting, they'd phoned Alfonso's mother to ask for his number. She had recalled Brian coming over with Alfonso at all hours of the night, visits that rarely ended well. Eckhart had done a quick online search and uncovered a string of criminal records, petty thefts, minor drug charges, nothing violent but enough to stall any real future. He wasn't dangerous, just unreliable. Combined with his appearance, those facts put both men on edge. They knew how easily desperation could twist the truth. Brian shuffled toward the table, each step deliberate, heavy. As he drew closer, Sides caught the overpowering blast of body spray, applied, it seemed, only minutes earlier and in far too much quantity. His shirt was stained, bearing the evidence of days, maybe weeks, without a wash. He extended a hand, grime in the creases of his fingers, and introduced himself. Sides and Eckhart shook it in turn, replying with their own names. Brian nodded and smiled faintly. That's when they saw it. Teeth decayed, darkened, crumbling at the edges. Meth, almost certainly. Their hearts sank. Neither spoke, but both stared at the ruined smile, the quiet cost of a life lived too close to the edge. "Brian," Sides said as the three settled into their seats. "You can call me Easy," Brian replied in a drawl that didn't quite belong anywhere. Easy? Sides raised an eyebrow. The boys downtown called me Easy Money, Brian said, grinning faintly, because I'd pay whatever they wanted. Oh, Sides exchanged a quick glance with Eckhart. It wasn't the sort of nickname a man in Brian's position would want to carry around, one that suggested weakness or worse, easy exploitation. Still, Sides pressed on. So, easy. You want to know what happened to Alfonso, right? That's why you called me down here. His tone was flat, matter of fact, as though the answer should have been obvious. He reached across the table, snagged a menu, and began flipping through it. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth when he found the dessert section. Sides leaned forward, hungry for more information, but cautious, feeling his way into the conversation. Eckhart leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already half convinced that Brian was here to spin a story and score a plate of free food. "What can you tell us?" Eckhart asked. Brian set the menu down on the table. "To be honest with you," he said slowly, "not a whole lot." "You said you could help us," Sides pressed. Brian leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "I mean, I can't tell you how he died, if that's what you're after." "No, we know what happened, Brian," Sides said evenly. "We need to find out why." Brian's brow furrowed. "You know what happened? What happened to him?" The concern in his voice was genuine, unfeigned. "He was killed just outside his home," Eckhart said. "Inside his car, in fact." Brian blinked. "Where was he living at?" Eckhart angled his head toward the eastern wall of the restaurant. Brian followed the gesture, then looked back confused. Out east?" "Yep," Sides confirmed. Eckhart gave a slow nod. Brian's confusion deepened. "That don't sound right." He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting away from them and down toward the menu in front of him. His mouth hung open slightly, but he wasn't reading. He was somewhere else, sifting through memories, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. And then, just as the silence thickened, a young waitress approached the table, breaking the moment. "Are we ready?" the server asked, her tone reserved but polite. "I'll have the ball of wax, hard scrambled," Eckhart said. "I'll take a chicken biscuit and a refill," Sides added. The server jotted down quick notes, then turned to Brian. She waited. He stared at the menu a moment, then looked to Sides and Eckhart, silent but clearly asking a question with his eyes. "Go ahead," Eckhart said. "Thanks," Brian said with sudden enthusiasm. He turned to the server. "I'll take a cup of coffee with extra sugar, 2 cinnamon rolls, and an order of biscuits. The biscuits are to go." The server nodded, scribbled, and walked off without another word. Sides couldn't help a brief cringe at the odd, heavy order, but straightened his posture before Brian turned back around. "Thanks, fellas," Brian said. Eckhart exhaled slowly, shifting back to the matter at hand. "Brian, what do you mean it doesn't make sense?" Brian leaned back, his brow furrowed. "I mean, have either of you ever heard of someone getting killed in their car out east? It's not really the kind of place you get carjacked. You know what I mean?" "Maybe," Eckhart said cautiously. "I'm sure it's happened before." "I mean, maybe," Brian replied, raising his chin with a defiant edge. "But it don't happen that often." "Sure," Eckhart said. "So, how was he killed?" Brian asked. "You don't know?" Sides tilted his head, studying him. Brian's tone sharpened. "You don't seriously think I had something to do with it, do you? Al was my boy. Al was my running partner. I hadn't seen him in so long, but that don't really matter." "No, Brian," Sides said, sounding impatient. He waved the notion away with both hands, then glanced toward Eckhart. "So, what happened?" Brian pressed. "Specifically?" Eckhart asked. "Yeah, specifically," Brian said, his voice edged with irritation. Eckhart hesitated, looking over to Sides. "Specifically, Brian," Sides said evenly, leaning in a fraction, "he was found with large gashes all over his upper torso. He either hemorrhaged to death or suffered major trauma to a vital organ. Brian fell silent, his eyes fixed on the table. The words hung in the air, drawing attention from nearby patrons. A couple at a corner booth glanced over. An older man pushed his chair back, murmured to the server, and asked for his check. Sides and Eckhart watched Brian closely. He wasn't speaking, wasn't even blinking much, just sitting there, processing. This was the crucial moment. His shock could mean two very different things. Either the details were too horrifying to believe, or he already knew exactly how it happened. One would stall their investigation. The other might finally push it forward. "I'll be darned," Brian finally said. "What?" Eckhart shot back sharper than he intended. He'd been expecting more. "Nothing, man," Brian replied, shaking his head. Just then, the server arrived, refilling drinks and setting a coffee and a water in front of Brian. They murmured their thanks. Brian took a sip of the coffee, set the mug down, then fished a piece of ice from his water with grimy fingers and dropped it into the cup. The splash sent droplets of coffee across the table. Sides immediately reached for napkins and handed them over. Brian took them without comment and began blotting the mess. "Brian," Sides prompted gently. Brian leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice low and insistent. "Look, fellas, that don't make no sense, him being killed like that. Alfonso was a good guy, man. He had his problems, sure, who doesn't? But there wouldn't be no reason for him to get killed like that." He raised his hands as he spoke, rocking them in rhythm with his words. His movements grew sharper, matching the urgency in his voice. "Look, I've heard about those South American boys killing each other like that. But Alfonso never got involved in anything like that. He didn't even like cocaine, and no one's gonna kill you over a couple grams of heroin or meth." Brian leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his eyes dropping to the menu before drifting up again. He shook his head slowly, still in disbelief. The three of them sat in a heavy silence. Sides and Eckhart both considered breaking it. They knew they had to keep him talking. They traded quick glances, each waiting for the other to make the next move. Before either could speak, Brian leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table and dragging his fingers through his hair. "Besides," he muttered, lifting his head and clasping his hands together. He was in that religious thing anyhow. A deep sigh escaped him as he slumped back into his chair. His brows arched briefly in a gesture of confusion before he crossed his arms again. "What religious thing?" Eckhart asked. "That thing," Brian said. "You know what I'm talking about." No, I don't, Brian," Eckhart replied, shaking his head. "That thing with those folks in the white suits," Brian said, his voice picking up. "They hand out little setups to all the homeless people downtown." "Setups?" Sides asked, leaning in. "Yeah, setups," Brian said, as if the meaning should have been obvious. "You know, setups." The two men exchanged a confused glance. "Setups, man," Brian repeated, leaning forward a little. "Little care packages, soap, granola bars, all the stuff you need on the street." "Oh," Sides said, a look of realization crossing his face. "Setups. Right." "Yeah, setups," Brian echoed, his gaze drifting toward some faraway point. He was all about that stuff. "Was he?" Eckhart asked. "Was this some kind of church thing, Brian?" Sides asked. "Some kind of church thing, I guess," Brian said with a shrug. "I saw him for the first time in years downtown, handing those setups out to everybody. I walked up to him and he remembered me. He gave me one, and fellas, I've got to tell you, he looked good, man. He looked really good." Brian nodded, rocking slightly in his chair, a small spark of pride in his eyes. I was proud of him. Proud of him for finally getting sober and sticking with it for once. I asked him if he'd found the Lord, because he was wearing one of those white suits, and he said that he had. "When was this?" Sides asked. "Back maybe 6 months ago or something," Brian said. I was in a tent then, downtown. I'm in a halfway house now." He smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in his expression. "Wait," Eckhart said, leaning forward. "Go back a bit. Had you seen these people before?" "Yes, sir," Brian replied with a single nod. "What's the deal? Are they down there all the time?" Eckhart pressed. "Well," Brian said, scratching his chin, "they're down there pretty regular, I guess. At least once a month. It's usually really young people that come. They hand out setups, clean up garbage, and hold some kind of prayer meeting I've never seen before. They seem like nice people, but they are not Christian." He stressed the last words as if they carried special weight. "Not Christian?" Sides repeated. "No, sir." Brian shook his head. "There's some kind of Indian or Chinese religion, I think, but none of them are Indian. There were a handful that were Chinese. At least I think so. One fellow was Chinese and he wore the same suit, but in black." "Did you ever talk to him?" Sides asked. "Number, I never talked to him," Brian said, his tone dropping, almost resigned. "There was something about him that always put me on edge. I never got one of those setups when he was there, and then he started showing up every single time. It wasn't too long after that I'd had enough and went back to rehab." Sides leaned back in his chair, visibly processing Brian's story. Eckhart could see it too, the weight of the details settling in. There were simply too many points of overlap with what the Silvas had told them for this to be coincidence. Instinctively, both men knew the conversation needed to pivot. It was clear now that Alfonso had become involved in some sort of New Age faith, likely with roots somewhere in Asia. There was no evidence he had relapsed, but a drug deal gone wrong still remained the most plausible explanation. They needed to know for certain. "Brian, did you ever see Alfonso again after you left rehab?" Eckhart asked. "No, sir," Brian said. "In fact, I'm not trying to be rude, but he hadn't really crossed my mind until you two called me the other day." Just then, the young server returned, carrying 3 plates balanced in her arms. Eckhart caught her movement in his peripheral vision. She announced each order softly as she placed the plates before them. Brian's eyes widened, and a genuine smile spread across his face. It was heartbreaking to see, humbling even. For all the self-inflicted chaos Eckhart had weathered over the past decade, cinnamon rolls would never have stirred that kind of joy in him. But for Brian, in his current state, they were luxury itself. The server stepped briskly back behind the counter, returning moments later with silverware wrapped in cloth napkins, an oversight she was quick to correct. Brian followed her movement, his gaze fixed as she walked behind the counter. He lifted his hand slightly, ready to catch her attention. "Fork?" Brian asked, looking up at her. The server didn't reply. Instead, she lifted the 3 rolled sets of silverware in both hands, presenting them with a small flourish. Brian let out an audible giggle. His eyes followed her movements as she set each bundle carefully beside their plates. Before she'd even stepped away, Brian was already tearing into his napkin, unrolling the silverware with frantic haste. Eckhart, Sides, and the young server all noticed, and, for a fleeting moment, shared the same feeling. There was something almost childlike in his eagerness, something both pitiful and oddly endearing. It tugged at their hearts in different ways. The server offered a polite smile before moving on to another table. Brian wasted no time. He dug into the cinnamon rolls with unrestrained hunger, shoveling bites in as though afraid they might vanish, eating with the single-minded urgency of someone who hadn't tasted indulgence in far too long. "Brian," Sides said. "Huh?" Brian looked up, his mouth smeared with cinnamon and sugar. "Do you think Alfonso stayed sober?" Sides asked. "Most likely," Brian said, stuffing another piece of cinnamon roll into his mouth. "So there's no doubt in your mind that Alfonso stayed sober?" Eckhart cut in. "I wouldn't say no doubt. That's a stretch," Brian admitted, finally wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Do you think there's any possibility Alfonso got caught up in a drug deal and was killed over it?" Sides asked. "Hell no," Brian shot back, the abruptness catching both Sides and Eckhart off guard. Crumbs scattered onto his lap as he spoke. He glanced down, swiped his face with the back of his hand, and brushed the crumbs to the floor. Then he planted both hands flat on the table, his eyes narrowing as he worked through his thoughts. Here's the thing. Alfonso had a hard time controlling himself. Hell, we all do. That's why we're addicts. If he was selling anything, he'd have been getting high on his own supply. And the kind of drugs he used, they aren't the kind you get killed over. Now, he paused, leaning forward slightly. If he'd switched to something else, something worth killing over, I doubt he'd still have a car or a house. He'd have traded those for the stuff. You understand? Sides and Eckhart exchanged a look. Brian's logic might have made sense to him, but both men knew there were far too many variables to treat it as conclusive. Still, somewhere in his meandering explanation, Brian had landed on a useful point. It was true. In the United States, certain drugs had far more homicides tied to their trade than others. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and now fentanyl, those were the usual suspects in drug-related killings. And Sides and Eckhart both knew that each of those drugs often drew different criminal networks, each with its own preferences and turf. Pinning down what Alfonso had been using could narrow their focus, and maybe their list of suspects. Sides broke the silence. "Brian, when did Alfonso start using meth?" Brian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, half snort, half giggle. Crumbs of cinnamon roll sprayed from his mouth, spattering across the table and striking Eckhart squarely in the chest. Eckhart jerked back in surprise, but not quickly enough. Brian, eyes squeezed shut and head tipped back, kept laughing, oblivious to the mess he'd just made. Eckhart pushed his plate away, grabbed his napkin, dipped a corner into his water glass, and began wiping the sticky flecks from his shirt with a tight-lipped grimace. "Alfonso wasn't into meth," Brian said, still chuckling under his breath. "Really?" Sides asked, brow furrowed in confusion. "No, man," Brian waved a hand dismissively. "He wasn't into anything like that. Alfonso was a tripper, man. He called himself a psychonaut, whatever the hell that means." "Wait," Sides said, leaning forward. "He called himself a what?" "A psychonaut," Brian repeated. "Said he was like an astronaut, but for the human psyche. I don't know what that meant, but he took a lot of acid and mushrooms." "As in hallucinogens?" Eckhart asked, still blotting at his shirt. "That's it," Brian said, snapping his fingers and pointing at Eckhart. "Hallucinogens. I couldn't think of the word." "He wasn't into meth, cocaine, or anything else?" Sides asked carefully. "Absolutely not," Brian said, shaking his head. "That's why when you mentioned a drug deal gone bad, I couldn't believe it." "But you said he would have been homeless and without a car," Sides countered. "That's right," Brian said, cramming the last bite of cinnamon roll into his mouth. "When you're on that crap as often as he was, you start trading everything you own and wandering around like a zombie. Listen, I've got my own problems with substances, but I don't mess with that junk. It'll fry your brain like an egg. It's not worth it. Besides, none of those fools ever get to where they think they're going. They stare at pigeons walking around and think it's deep. Truth is, there's nothing deep about it." Sides and Eckhart both drew in long breaths, leaning back in their chairs. This wasn't the turn they expected. Sides had been certain the story would go a different way, that a relapsed Alfonso had resorted to selling methamphetamine to feed his habit, hoping his parents would bail him out. And when they didn't, the suppliers came for revenge. Eckhart's own theory had been similar but darker. Alfonso relapsing, stealing money from his parents to buy a large quantity of drugs, then walking into a setup, lured under false pretenses, and killed when his dealers discovered he had no merchandise at all. But now, with Brian's description, those scenarios felt shaky. What Brian described, Alfonso as a so-called psychonaut, obsessed with hallucinogens, didn't fit either narrative, and yet neither man could dismiss it outright. Yet neither of them could accept the idea that Alfonso had been killed in some back alley deal for hallucinogenic mushrooms. The thought spun out into stranger possibilities. Perhaps another self-styled psychonaut, as Alfonso called them, had lashed out in the middle of a trip, seeing Alfonso as some monstrous figure that needed to be destroyed. Maybe they'd struck him with an axe and vanished into the night. But that theory crumbled almost as soon as it surfaced. Anyone in that state would have been so disoriented they'd either lash out again or wander aimlessly until the police picked them up. None of it made sense. "I'll get the check," Eckhart said, pushing back from the table. He crossed to the register, pulled a card from his wallet, and handed it to the young server. As he entered his PIN, he cast a glance back at Sides, a quick nod that it was time to leave. Sides rose as well. Brian, oblivious, was still scraping the last streaks of cinnamon and sugar from his plate, chasing one final bite. Sides opened his wallet, fingering through the bills until he found the only 20 he had. He held it out near Brian's shoulder. Brian looked up, hesitant, then took the bill with a brief, uncertain glance. "Take care of yourself," Sides said. "Thank you," Brian replied. Just then, his to-go biscuits arrived in a foam container. He glanced inside, inspecting the contents, oblivious to the fact that Sides had already stepped away. By the time Brian looked up, he was alone. He shifted in his chair and looked back toward the entrance. The door was closing, the silhouettes of Sides and Eckhart vanishing into the bright morning outside. Brian swallowed hard, then turned back to the container. He opened it, pulled out a biscuit, and took a slow bite. The $20 bill caught his eye. He raised it briefly, staring at it as though weighing its worth, then shoved it deep into his front pocket. He took another bite of the biscuit, chewing slowly, already turning over in his mind where he might score next.